Who's there? I can feel you watching me. Show yourself!
The following story contains elements of suspense, psychological tension, and supernatural themes. It is intended for audiences who enjoy atmospheric horror and American folklore. Viewer discretion is advised for younger children. Deep in the heart of Maryland, where the ancient oaks stretch their gnarled limbs like skeletal fingers against the gray sky, sits a house that the locals refuse to name. They call it the Hollow Place or the Grinning Manor. But on the official deeds, it is Blackwood Hall. It is a place where the wind doesn't just blow. It sighs with the weight of 100 years of secrets. For the Miller family, it was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to trade the frantic, neon-soaked pulse of Baltimore for the quiet, rolling hills of the countryside. But as the iron gates groaned open, protesting their arrival, the air grew thick with a cold that had nothing to do with the Maryland winter. Julian Miller gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was a man of logic, a professor of history who believed that every haunting was just a drafty window and every ghost was merely a trick of the light. Behind him, his wife, Beatrice, watched the way the fog clung to the windows of the house. She was an artist, someone who saw the world in shades of emotion, and right now the house looked like a bruise on the landscape. Their young son, Leo, sat in the back, clutching his stuffed bear, his eyes wide as he stared at the towering Victorian structure. It was beautiful, yes, but it was the kind of beauty that felt like a trap, a gilded cage waiting for its next occupants. The house was an architectural marvel of the late 19th century, featuring wraparound porches, ornate gingerbread trim, and a widow's walk that looked out over the dense, suffocating forest. But as they stepped onto the porch, the wood didn't just creak. It seemed to moan beneath their feet. Julian fumbled with the heavy brass key, the metal feeling unnervingly warm in his hand. When the door finally swung open, the smell hit them, not of rot or decay, but of old roses and burnt wax, a scent that belonged to a time long since past. Inside, the foyer was grand, with a sweeping staircase that disappeared into the shadows of the second floor. "It's bigger than the photos," Beatrice whispered, her voice sounding strangely flat, as if the walls were absorbing the sound before it could travel. Julian nodded, though a small seed of unease began to sprout in his chest. He looked at the floor plan he had printed out. According to the paper, the hallway to the left should have been 10 feet long, leading to the kitchen. Instead, it stretched out into a long, dimly lit corridor that seemed to vibrate with a low, sub-audible hum. As they began to unpack, the first of the oddities occurred. Leo had gone to his new bedroom, a sun-drenched space on the second floor, but within minutes he came running back down, his face pale. He claimed that when he put his toys on the rug, they rolled toward the center of the room, as if the floor were slanted, yet a marble placed on the floor stayed perfectly still. Julian laughed it off, attributing it to the house settling, but when he went up to check, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The window in Leo's room looked out over the backyard, but the backyard he saw wasn't the one they had just walked through. The trees were different, vibrant, green, and swaying in a wind that didn't exist outside. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floors. In the kitchen, Beatrice was trying to light the vintage stove, but the matches kept flickering out, even though there was no draft. She felt a sudden, sharp chill on the back of her neck, like a cold finger tracing her spine. When she turned around, she thought she saw a woman standing in the pantry, a tall, elegant figure in a high-collared dress. But when she blinked, the pantry was empty, save for the dusty shelves and a single, cracked teacup sitting in the center of the floor. That evening, As they sat around the heavy oak dining table, the silence of the Maryland woods felt heavy. In the city, there was always the sound of sirens, tires on pavement, or distant shouting. Here, the silence was active. It felt like something was listening, waiting for them to speak so it could catch their words. Julian tried to keep the conversation light, talking about the renovations and the history he wanted to write. But Leo remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the dark corners of the room. "Dad," Leo whispered, pointing toward the hallway. "Why is there a door where there wasn't one before?" Julian turned, his brow furrowing. At the end of the hall, near the cellar entrance, stood a small, arched door made of dark walnut. It wasn't on the blueprints. It wasn't there when they did the walkthrough with the realtor. It was just there. Julian stood up, his academic curiosity fighting with a primal sense of dread. He walked toward the door, his hand reaching for the glass knob. As his fingers brushed the glass, a sudden, violent thud echoed from the other side, as if something heavy had been thrown against the wood. The house seemed to shudder, the crystal chandelier above the dining table chiming like a funeral bell. Julian pulled his hand back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Beatrice, who had risen from her chair, her face a mask of terror. For a moment, the air in the room felt thin, as if the house were breathing in, sucking the oxygen out of their lungs. Then, as quickly as it had started, the tension snapped. The house fell silent again. The door remained closed, its dark wood gleaming in the dim light. Julian took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "It's just the pipes," he said, though the lie felt heavy in his mouth. "Old houses have a way of playing tricks on you. We're all tired from the move." He ushered his family upstairs, locking the doors behind them. But as he lay in bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was changing shape around them, expanding and contracting like a living lung. The moral of this first night was one the Millers had yet to learn. One should never prioritize the grandeur of a home over the peace of the soul. They had moved into Blackwood Hall seeking a legacy, but they had failed to ask why such a masterpiece had been left empty for so long. As the moon rose over the Maryland pines, the small walnut door in the hallway began to creak open, just an inch, revealing nothing but a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The first day was over, but the house was only just beginning to wake up. The Millers were no longer guests. They were now part of the architecture, and Blackwood Hall was a very hungry host. The morning sun in rural Maryland is usually a welcome sight, a golden flood that burns the mist off the Chesapeake and warms the damp earth. But inside Blackwood Hall, the light seemed to lose its strength. It filtered through the tall, narrow windows in thin, sickly ribbons, illuminating millions of dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, frantic insects. Julian Miller woke with a start, his heart racing for no reason he could name. The house was silent, yet it was a heavy silence, the kind that feels like a weight pressing against your eardrums. He looked at Beatrice, still asleep beside him, her brow furrowed as if she were locked in a dream she couldn't escape. Julian headed downstairs, the floorboards groaning under his weight with a rhythmic, almost intentional sound. He decided to focus on his work, hoping that the familiar comfort of his history books would ground him. The library of Blackwood Hall was a massive, circular room lined with shelves that reached the ceiling. It smelled of vanilla, old leather, and a metallic tang that reminded Julian of a wet penny. He sat at the center desk, a heavy mahogany piece that felt as solid as an anchor. But as he opened his laptop, the hum of the house began, a low, vibrating thud that seemed to come from beneath the floor. First, he ignored it. Then the whispers started. They weren't voices in the traditional sense. They sounded like the dry rustle of autumn leaves skittering across a stone porch. "Not yours. Never yours." The words were faint, brushing against the edge of his hearing. Julian froze, his pen hovering over a notepad. He looked around the room, expecting to see a draft moving a curtain or a mouse behind the wainscoting. But the room was still. He stood up and walked toward the far corner, where the sound seemed most concentrated. As he moved, the floor beneath him felt wrong. In certain spots, the wood felt as soft as moss. In others, it was ice-cold even through his wool socks. He began to tap on the walls, listening for the hollow echoes of hidden spaces. Julian was a man who believed in the tangible, in facts and blueprints. He pulled out the original 1890 architectural sketches he had acquired from the local historical society. According to the map, the library was a perfect circle. But as Julian paced it out, counting his steps, the math didn't add up. There was a discrepancy of nearly 6 feet on the eastern wall. His hands shook slightly as he began to move the books, shifting heavy, leather-bound volumes on the history of Maryland's tobacco trade. Behind a row of encyclopedias he found it, a small, recessed brass ring. With a grunt of effort, Julian pulled. A section of the shelving swung inward with a silent, ghostly smoothness that suggested the hinges had been recently oiled. Behind the shelf lay a room that shouldn't have existed. It was a narrow, windowless study, no larger than a closet, lit by a single, flickering gas-style lamp that was somehow already burning. The air inside the hidden room was frigid, smelling of damp earth and something sweet, like rotting peaches. In the center of the room sat a small stool and a narrow desk covered in charcoal drawings. Julian picked one up. It was a sketch of the very room he was standing in, but in the drawing the walls were covered in eyes. Thousands of them, rendered in obsessive detail, all looking toward the center of the room. At the bottom of the page, a single name was scrawled in jagged, frantic handwriting. Caleb Blackwood. Suddenly, the door to the hidden room slammed shut. The lamp flickered and died, plunging Julian into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. The whispers returned, louder now. No longer a rustle, but a chorus of overlapping voices. They were arguing, sobbing, and laughing all at once. Julian felt a hand, cold and skeletal, brush against his cheek. He let out a strangled cry and threw his weight against the hidden door. It didn't budge. He felt the walls beginning to vibrate, the very wood of the house seemingly humming with a malevolent glee. "Julian? Are you in there?" Beatrice's voice came from the library, sounding miles away. Julian hammered on the wood, his voice cracking as he called her name. With a violent jerk, the door swung open, and Julian tumbled out onto the library floor, gasping for air. Beatrice stood there, holding a tray of coffee, looking at him with a mixture of confusion and concern. "What are you doing in the wall?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Julian looked back, but the bookshelf was closed. The brass ring was gone. The encyclopedias were perfectly in place. He stood up, brushing the dust from his clothes, his mind racing to find a rational explanation. "Just checking the insulation," he stammered, unable to meet her eyes. He didn't tell her about the drawings or the cold hand. He didn't tell her that for a moment, in that darkness, he had felt like the house was trying to digest him. But as they walked toward the kitchen, Julian noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the dusty floor of the library, there were 2 sets of footprints leading into the wall, but only one set leading out. The moral of this discovery was a bitter pill. Some doors are meant to stay closed for a reason, and curiosity is a key that can sometimes lock you in. Julian had sought the truth of the house, but the house had responded by showing him a glimpse of its own fractured mind. He realized then that Blackwood Hall wasn't just a building. It was a record of every tragedy that had ever occurred within its walls, and it was looking for a new chapter to write. As the afternoon shadows grew long, Beatrice went to the hallway mirror to pin up her hair. She stood there for a long time, her hands frozen. In the reflection, she saw Julian walking behind her toward the stairs. But when she turned around, the hallway was empty. Julian was still in the kitchen. She looked back at the mirror, and her reflection wasn't looking at her anymore. It was looking at the stairs, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across its face. There is an old superstition in the Appalachian foothills and the coastal lowlands of Maryland that says mirrors are not just glass and silver, but windows into a world that runs parallel to our own, a world that is always hungry and never quite right. At Blackwood Hall, the mirrors were grand, framed in heavy, tarnished gilt and speckled with age. By the third morning, Beatrice Miller found herself avoiding them. The house was beginning to feel like a heavy coat that didn't fit, pressing against her shoulders and making every breath feel shallow. The air in the master suite was cold, despite the sun beating against the window pane, and the silence was no longer empty. It felt crowded. Beatrice stood before the vanity in the guest bathroom, trying to steady her hands as she applied her makeup. She was a woman of color and light, an artist who understood how shadows could define a face. But the shadows in this house were behaving poorly. As she moved her brush, she felt a strange, sickening sensation of lag, as if the world were a second behind her movements. She paused, her heart thudding. In the mirror, her reflection didn't stop immediately. It continued the stroke of the brush for a fraction of a second longer before freezing. Beatrice gasped, dropping the brush. It clattered into the sink, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. She backed away, her eyes locked on the glass. Her reflection didn't look scared. It looked annoyed. The other Beatrice narrowed its eyes, and for a heartbeat, its skin looked like gray parchment. Beatrice turned and ran from the room, her footsteps thundering on the carpeted hallway. She found Julian in the kitchen, staring blankly at a pot of water that refused to boil. The kitchen clock clicked, a heavy, mechanical sound, but the second hand was moving backward. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The mirrors. Something is wrong with the mirrors." Julian looked up, and for a moment, Beatrice didn't recognize him. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a frantic, wild energy in his gaze that she had never seen in their 10 years of marriage. "It's not just the mirrors, Bea," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Look at the time." He pointed to the clock. It was 9 a.m. when they sat down for breakfast. Now the clock read 3:15 p.m., yet the sun was still in the same position in the sky. The house was stretching the day, or perhaps it was pulling the family out of time altogether. The sense of reality was fraying at the edges, like a tapestry being unraveled by an invisible hand. The conflict deepened when Leo cried out from the parlor. They found him standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling pier glass, a relic from the house's original owner. Leo wasn't crying because he was hurt. He was crying because he couldn't find his shadow. The boy stood in a pool of afternoon light, but the floor behind him was empty. In the mirror, however, his shadow was visible, but it wasn't standing behind the reflected Leo. It was detached, pacing back and forth along the edge of the silvered glass, its fingers elongated into claws. The house was separating them from their own identities, treating their bodies and their souls as two different things to be toyed with. Beatrice grabbed Leo, pulling him away from the glass. But as she did, the glass began to ripple like water. A low, rhythmic thumping started behind the walls, the sound of a giant heart beating in the basement. The house was no longer a passive observer. It was actively trying to deceive them. Every time Beatrice turned a corner, she saw a flicker of movement in the polished wood of the furniture or the glass of a picture frame. The people in the reflections were getting closer, stepping toward the surface of the glass, as if they were trying to break through into the real world. The tension peaked when Beatrice went to the hallway to retrieve a fallen coat. She caught her reflection in a small decorative mirror by the coat rack. This time, the reflection didn't mimic her at all. It reached out its hand, the fingers pressing against the inside of the glass, creating a frost that clouded the surface. The reflection's mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a puff of cold white mist. It began to scream a silent, terrifying scream, its face contorting into a mask of madness. Beatrice felt a sudden, sharp pain in her own throat, as if the reflection were stealing her voice. Julian rushed to her side, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from a side table. With a roar of frustration and fear, he swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds, and for a second, a high-pitched, metallic shriek filled the air. The shards fell to the floor, and the image of the screaming woman vanished. But as they looked down at the broken pieces, each tiny fragment still held a piece of the other world. A tiny eye, a sliver of a mouth, a grasping finger. The house had been broken, but the infection was only spreading. The family retreated to the center of the living room, huddling together on the rug, away from anything reflective. They realized that their eyes could no longer be trusted. The house was painting a nightmare on the canvas of their reality, using their own faces as the brushes. Julian gripped Beatrice's hand, his fingers trembling. "We have to stay together," he whispered. "Don't look at the glass. Don't look at anything that shows you yourself." But even as he spoke, he looked down at the polished surface of his watch, and for a split second, he saw his own face aged by 50 years, his eyes hollow and leaking darkness. The partial resolution came with the realization that the house fed on their recognition of the horror. When they closed their eyes and leaned on one another, the thumping in the walls slowed. The distorted time seemed to stabilize, the shadows returning to their proper places. But the cost was high. They were now prisoners in their own home, afraid to even glance at a window for fear of what might be looking back. The psychological toll was mounting, and the insanity the locals spoke of was no longer a legend. It was a looming destination. The moral of this harrowing afternoon was clear. Trust your instincts over your eyes, for the world can be painted with illusions, but the heart knows the truth of the dark. Beatrice and Julian had relied on their senses to navigate the world, but in Blackwood Hall, those senses were being turned into weapons against them. They learned that the only way to survive a house built on lies was to hold onto the one thing that was real, their love for one another. As the real sun finally began to set, casting the Maryland woods into a deep, bruised purple, Leo pointed to the front door. A faint, glowing light was beginning to seep through the keyhole. It wasn't the light of a flashlight or a car. It was a cold, ghostly blue. Somewhere in the distance, a music box began to play a slow, distorted lullaby that seemed to be coming from the very ceiling above their heads. The attic, a place they had not yet dared to visit, was calling to them. There is a specific kind of cold that exists only in the high corners of old Maryland houses. A damp, stagnant chill that feels as though the air itself has forgotten how to move. Above the grand ceilings of Blackwood Hall lay the attic, a cavernous space of unfinished timber and forgotten relics. For days, the attic had been a silent observer of the family's growing dread. But as the third night bled into the fourth morning, the silence was replaced by a sound that was far more unsettling. The thin, tinny chime of a music box, playing a melody that felt like a needle scratching against the soul. Leo was the first to hear it. While Julian and Beatrice were downstairs, huddled over old maps and trying to ignore the shifting geometry of the hallways, Leo stood at the base of the pull-down attic stairs. He didn't look like a 6-year-old boy anymore. His posture was stiff, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. The music was a winding, repetitive lullaby, ancient and weary. Without a word to his parents, Leo climbed the rickety wooden slats, disappearing into the darkness of the rafters. The house seemed to hold its breath as he reached the top, the trapdoor closing behind him with a soft, final click. The attic was a graveyard of the 19th century. Trunks filled with moth-eaten velvet, broken spinning wheels, and portraits with eyes that seemed to track the boy's every move. In the center of the room, sitting on a pile of dusty hay, was a small wooden box. It was carved from dark mahogany, depicting a scene of a forest where the trees had human faces. As Leo approached, the lid creaked open of its own accord. Inside, a small porcelain figure of a boy began to spin. But the figure wasn't dancing. It was stumbling, its tiny hands reaching out as if trying to grasp something just beyond the edge of the box. "Hello, Silas," Leo whispered to the empty air. He sat down cross-legged, his eyes glazed and vacant. To anyone else, the room was empty, but to Leo, a boy in a tattered woolen suit from the 1840s was sitting right across from him. This imaginary friend didn't speak with words. He spoke with images that flashed in Leo's mind, images of the house being built not out of wood and stone, but out of sorrow and a desperate need to keep the dead from leaving. Silas showed him the insanity that had claimed the families before them. It wasn't a disease of the brain, but a slow replacement of the self with the house's own memories. Downstairs, Beatrice noticed the silence first. The absence of Leo's footsteps was a loud, ringing alarm in her ears. "Julian, where's Leo?" she cried out, her voice echoing through the distorted hallways. They searched the parlor, the library, and the kitchen, but the boy was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until Julian heard the faint, discordant tinkling of the music box coming from above that they realized where he had gone. They raced to the attic stairs, Julian pulling the cord with a desperate yank. The air that rushed down from the attic smelled of old earth and something metallic, like dried blood. When they reached the top, they found Leo, but he wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to be reaching toward him, weaving themselves into his clothes and hair. He was humming along with the music box, a sound that was far too deep and resonant for a child's throat. When Beatrice reached out to touch him, Leo turned his head. Not just his head, but his entire torso with a slow, mechanical grace. "Silas says we can't leave," Leo said, his voice a flat, emotionless drone. "Silas says the house is still hungry, and we are the dessert." Julian lunged for the music box, intent on smashing it against the floor, but as his hand neared the dark wood, the melody changed. It became a screeching, dissonant wall of sound that vibrated the very bones in his skull. He was thrown backward by an invisible force, hitting a stack of old trunks. Beatrice screamed, grabbing Leo and pulling him toward the exit, but the boy was heavy, as if he were made of lead. The porcelain figure in the box began to spin faster and faster, its painted face twisting into a silent howl of agony. The conflict reached a fever pitch as the attic floor began to ripple like the surface of a pond. The insanity was manifesting. Julian saw the walls of the attic dissolve, replaced by a vision of the Maryland woods in 1840. He saw a man in a black frock coat, the original architect, burying something beneath the foundation of the house while a young boy watched from a high window. The vision was so vivid that Julian felt the cold wind of the past biting at his skin. He realized that Leo wasn't just talking to a ghost. He was being used as a bridge for the house to pull the past into the present. With a surge of fatherly instinct, Julian ignored the pain in his head and scrambled toward his son. He didn't grab the box this time. He grabbed Leo's hand and began to recite a prayer his grandmother had taught him, a simple blessing for the home. Beatrice joined in, her voice steadying as she focused on the love she had for her child. The music box began to smoke, the wood charring as if an invisible fire were consuming it. With a final, piercing note, the porcelain figure shattered, and the attic returned to its dusty, silent state. Leo blinked, the milkiness fading from his eyes. He collapsed into his mother's arms, weeping with a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. "I'm sorry, Mommy," he sobbed. The music was so pretty at first. Julian picked up the charred remains of the music box. It was cold now, its malevolence dampened but not entirely gone. They retreated from the attic, Julian bolting the trapdoor behind them and placing a heavy chest over it. For now, the friend was locked away, but the house felt more alive than ever, the walls thrumming with a redirected anger. The moral of this terrifying encounter was a heavy one. Innocence is a light that the darkness seeks to extinguish first. It must be guarded with a parent's unwavering vigilance. Julian and Beatrice realized that their son was the primary target because his mind was the most open to the house's influence. They could no longer afford to be logical or rational. They had to accept that they were at war with a structure that wanted their very souls. As they sat in the living room, the three of them huddled together on the sofa, the house began to change again. The hallways didn't just feel longer. They were beginning to curve. Julian looked at the architectural sketches he had left on the table. The ink was moving. The lines were redrawing themselves, forming a pattern that looked less like a house and more like a human heart. They needed to know who that man in the black coat was. They needed to find the architect's sin. Knowledge is often a lantern in the dark, but in the halls of Blackwood, the more the Miller family learned, the more the shadows seemed to sharpen. The morning after the incident in the attic, the Maryland air was thick with a humid, oppressive heat that seemed to seep through the very stones of the house. Julian sat in the center of the library, the air smelling of ozone and old, rotting paper. The architectural sketches he had brought with him were no longer static images. Under the flickering light of his desk lamp, the ink lines crawled across the parchment like a colony of black ants, redrawing the boundaries of the house. The library was no longer just a room. It was becoming a node in a complex, shifting web. Julian realized that he couldn't rely on modern records to understand the insanity that claimed every family who walked through these doors. He had to look into the soul of the man who laid the first stone. Through a frantic search of digitized local archives and old census records, a name finally emerged from the murky history of the 1840s: Thaddeus Thorne. Thorne had been a brilliant, reclusive architect from Baltimore who had disappeared from society after a dual tragedy: the sudden death of his young wife and his only son, Silas. Blackwood Hall hadn't been built as a residence. It was a monument to a father's refusal to say goodbye. Beatrice joined Julian, her face drawn and tired. She looked at the laptop screen, where a grainy photo of a daguerreotype showed Thaddeus Thorne. He was a man with hollowed-out eyes and a mouth set in a grim, permanent line of defiance. "He didn't want them to leave," Beatrice whispered, her intuition as an artist piercing through the historical data. "He didn't build a home, Julian. He built a cage." As they read further, the horrifying truth began to take shape. Thorne believed that the soul was a physical entity that could be confused by geometry. He had studied ancient spirit traps and combined them with Victorian engineering to create a house where a spirit would get lost in a loop of hallways and stay forever. The conflict escalated as the house seemed to realize its secret was being unraveled. The library doors suddenly slammed shut with a force that rattled the books on their shelves. The ink on the blueprints began to leak off the page, pooling on the mahogany desk and forming words in a jagged, archaic script. "Stay with US." The temperature in the room plummeted. and the low hum they had heard since their first day rose to a deafening thrum, vibrating the floorboards until Julian's teeth ached. The house was a machine, a living mechanism of grief that required tenants to keep the engine of the trap running. Julian tried to stand, but the floor beneath his chair felt like it was turning to liquid. "We have to find the heart of this place," he shouted over the roar of the house. "If Thorn built a trap, there has to be a mechanism that powers it." He grabbed a heavy iron fire poker, feeling a surge of protective rage. He realized that every family who had gone insane here hadn't simply lost their minds. They had been slowly dismantled by the house, their personalities stripped away to fill the void left by Thorn's lost family. The insanity was the sound of a human soul being forced to fit into a non-Euclidean space. As they struggled to open the library door, the walls began to weep. A dark, viscous liquid, looking like old ink mixed with salt water, trailed down the wallpaper, obscuring the floral patterns. From the shadows, the figure of Thaddeus Thorn seemed to manifest, not as a ghost, but as a distortion in the air, a ripple of pure, concentrated sorrow. He wasn't attacking them. He was simply there, a heavy presence that made it difficult to think or move. The Miller family wasn't just living in a haunted house. They were living inside a man's obsession, and the obsession was growing hungry. With a desperate heave, Julian managed to pry the door open. They ran into the hallway, but the hallway was no longer the one they knew. It had elongated, the ceiling rising into a vaulted, cathedral-like height where shadows hung like bats. Beatrice grabbed Julian's arm, her eyes wide. "The house is reacting to us knowing the truth. It's trying to rewrite itself so we can't find the way out." They could hear Leo calling for them from upstairs, his voice sounding thin and distant, as if he were miles away instead of just one floor up. The resolution of this discovery came when Julian found a small, hidden inscription near the base of the grand staircase, carved in the same walnut as the mysterious door from their first night. It read, "Love is the anchor, but grief is the sea." Julian realized that the house didn't just feed on fear. It fed on the unwillingness to let go. Thaddeus Thorn had sinned against the natural order of life and death, and the Millers were now the fuel for his eternal mourning. By identifying the architect's sin, they had stripped away the house's mask, but they had also become its greatest threat. The moral of this revelation was a sobering one. One cannot build a future on a foundation of lies or a refusal to accept the cycle of life. Thaddeus Thorn had tried to cheat death with architecture, but he had only succeeded in creating a monument to madness. The Millers learned that the bargain of the house, the beauty and the price, was a trap designed to ensnare those who seek to escape their own realities. As they stood at the foot of the stairs, the house began to groan and shift with a new, terrifying intensity. The walls didn't just move, they began to fold. The library they had just left was gone, replaced by a stone wall that looked like it had been there for centuries. The exit was no longer where the front door should be. They were now inside the labyrinth, and the living trap was beginning to close its teeth. The laws of physics are the silent promises the world makes to us, that a floor will remain solid, that a door will lead where it always has, and that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But inside Blackwood Hall, those promises were being broken one by one. The house had stopped pretending to be a building. As the Millers stood in the flickering light of the foyer, they watched in paralyzed silence as the mahogany panels of the walls slid over one another like the scales of a giant serpent. The hallway leading to the kitchen didn't just grow longer. It began to curve upward at an impossible angle, until the back door was visible directly above their heads, hanging from the ceiling like a trapdoor to nowhere. Julian, Beatrice, and Leo huddled together, the air around them humming with a frequency that made their skin crawl. "Don't move," Julian commanded. his voice barely a whisper. He reached out to touch the wall, but his hand didn't meet wood. Instead, his fingers sank into a substance that felt like cold, wet silk. The house was no longer made of timber and stone. It was reconstructing itself out of their memories and their fears. The grand staircase suddenly split down the middle, the left side spiraling into a darkness that smelled of damp earth, while the right side dissolved into a shimmering mist. The conflict shifted from the physical to the psychological as the insanity truly began to take root. The house wasn't just moving walls. It was whispering into the cracks of their relationships. Beatrice felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of resentment toward Julian. Why had he brought them here? Why had his obsession with history blinded him to the danger? Every time he looked at her, his eyes seemed wider, more predatory. "You wanted this?" she snapped, her voice sounding harsh and distorted in the echoing space. "You and your books. You've trapped us in your own head." Julian turned to her, his face twisting into a mask of frustration. "I wanted a home for us. I didn't know the world was going to break." As they argued, the house responded to their discord. With every harsh word, a new wall slammed down between them, physicalizing their emotional distance. Within minutes, the foyer had transformed into a jagged maze of dead ends and false corridors. Julian reached for Beatrice's hand, but a pillar of dark stone rose from the floor, separating them. In the sudden isolation, the whispers of Thaddeus Thorne grew louder, a chorus of 1,000 grieving souls telling them that they were alone, that they had always been alone. Leo stood in the center of a small, square room that had formed around him. There were no doors, only 4 identical mirrors on each wall. He saw himself reflected into infinity, but in every third reflection, he wasn't a child. He was an old man or a skeleton or a shadow. The house was trying to show him all the versions of himself that would never happen if he stayed within these walls. "Mom! Dad!" he cried out, but his voice didn't travel. It hit the mirrors and bounced back, overlapping until the room was filled with a cacophony of his own screams. He felt the temptation to just sit down and let the insanity wash over him, to become just another echo in the wood. Julian hammered against the new stone pillar, his knuckles bleeding. He realized that the house was feeding on their anger. It was a scavenger of negative emotion, using their friction as the fuel to keep the labyrinth shifting. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing his heart rate to slow. "Beatrice," he shouted, softening his tone. "I'm sorry. I love you. Don't listen to the house. It's trying to make us hate each other, so it can win." On the other side of the stone, Beatrice froze. The red mist of anger in her mind began to clear, replaced by a cold, sharp realization. The house wasn't just a trap, it was a mirror. They began to speak to each other through the walls, not about the house or the danger, but about their lives. About the day Leo was born, about their first date in Baltimore, about the small, mundane things that made them a family. As they reconnected, the labyrinth began to react. The stone pillar between them didn't disappear, but it became translucent, like clouded glass. The geometry of the room began to soften. They realized that their unity was a form of structural integrity that the house couldn't easily dismantle. The insanity was the result of the soul being isolated. As long as they were together in spirit, the house couldn't fully claim them. With a final, shared effort of will, Julian and Beatrice moved toward each other's voices. They didn't look at the walls or the shifting floor. They focused entirely on the sound of the other's breathing. In a sudden, violent shudder, the stone pillar shattered into dust, and the walls of Leo's mirror prison dissolved. They crashed into each other in the center of the foyer, a tangle of limbs and tears. The house let out a low, mournful groan, like a beast that had missed its strike. The hallways remained distorted, and the exits were still hidden, but for the first time since they arrived, the air felt clear. The resolution was temporary, but vital. They had stopped the insanity from claiming their minds, but they were still physically trapped inside a shifting nightmare. Julian looked up at the ceiling where the back door still hung. "We can't just find an exit," he said, his voice steady now. "The house won't give us one. We have to make one. We have to go to the source of the grief." He looked toward the cellar door, which was now vibrating with a dull, rhythmic light. The heart of the labyrinth wasn't in the attic or the library. It was in the dark, unmapped spaces beneath the foundation. The moral of this harrowing trial was etched into their hearts. Unity is the strongest shield against the darkness. When we stand together, the walls of the world cannot truly divide us. The Millers had learned that the house's greatest power was the ability to make a person feel like an island. By refusing to let go of each other, they had reclaimed the center of their own reality. As they moved toward the cellar, the shadows on the walls didn't just flicker, they detached. The other versions of themselves they had seen in the mirrors were now walking the hallways, silent and gray. They were the echoes of what the family could become if they failed. The final descent was beginning, and the house was no longer hiding its intention. It wanted to keep them forever, not as people but as part of its own tragic history. The descent into the cellar of Blackwood Hall was not a walk down a flight of stairs. It was a journey into the gullet of a beast. The air changed instantly, turning from the stagnant heat of the labyrinth to a wet, grave-like chill that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of their bones. Julian held the iron fire poker like a talisman, his flashlight beam cutting through a darkness that felt as thick as ink. Behind him, Beatrice and Leo moved in a tight formation, their breathing synchronized in a rhythm of pure survival. The walls here weren't covered in Victorian wallpaper or elegant wood. They were raw, sweating limestone, etched with strange, geometric symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. As they reached the base of the stairs, the flashlight began to flicker and die. Julian shook it, but the light didn't return. Instead, a soft, amber glow began to bleed from the walls. Julian blinked, and the cellar began to dissolve. The damp stone was replaced by plush Persian rugs. The smell of rot was overtaken by the scent of expensive pipe tobacco and old parchment. He wasn't in a basement anymore. He was standing in a sun-drenched study, his hands resting on a desk of polished ebony. Outside the window, the Maryland countryside wasn't a gray, haunted forest, but a vibrant landscape of gold and green, untouched by time or sorrow. "Welcome home, Julian," a voice said. A voice like the rustle of dry silk. Julian turned to see a man standing by the fireplace. It was Thaddeus Thorne, but not the hollowed-out specter from the archives. He looked dignified, his eyes bright with intelligence and a terrifying kind of kindness. He held out a crystal glass filled with amber liquid. "You look tired, Professor. You've been wandering in the dark for so long. Why not sit? Why not stay where things make sense?" Julian felt a wave of profound peace wash over him. The fear that had gripped him for days vanished, replaced by a sense of academic belonging. This was the life he had always wanted, the prestige, the quiet, the safety of a world that didn't break. But as Julian reached for the glass, he heard a sound, a distant, distorted screech. He looked toward the door of the study. Through the translucent wood, he saw two hideous, gray shapes clawing at the walls. They were twisted things, their faces elongated into masks of agony, their voices sounding like the wind through a graveyard. "What are those?" Julian asked, a flicker of disgust crossing his face. Thorne smiled sadly. "Those are the shadows of your burdens, Julian, the ghosts of a life that failed you. If you stay here, in the heart of the hall, they can never touch you again. You can have the perfection you've always sought. You just have to let the house finish its work. The insanity was finally taking hold. To Julian, his wife and son were no longer his family. They were the monsters trying to drag him back into the cold. He looked at Beatrice, the gray shape, and felt only a desire to be rid of her. The house was offering him a bargain. His soul in exchange for a perfect lie. He saw his books on the shelves, saw his papers finished and published, saw a version of himself that was never afraid and never weak. All he had to do was turn his back on the monsters at the door. He picked up a pen, ready to sign the ledger that Thorn placed before him. A book bound in human leather that smelled of the very first day of creation. Suddenly, a small hand brushed against Julian's real leg, back in the darkness of the cellar. "Daddy, please wake up. You're hurting my hand." It was Leo's voice, but it sounded small and fragile, cutting through the amber warmth of the hallucination like a diamond through glass. Julian looked down at the hand he was holding in the perfect study. In the vision, he was holding a golden trophy. In reality, he was crushing Leo's small hand with a grip of iron. The perfect world around him began to flicker. The sun outside turned into a swirling vortex of ash. Thorn's face didn't change, but his shadow on the wall grew 10 feet tall, its fingers reaching for Julian's throat. Julian looked at the monsters again. He forced himself to look past the gray mist the house had draped over his eyes. He saw Beatrice's wedding ring, glinting in the dark. He saw the way Leo's hair curled behind his ear. The love he felt for them was a jagged, painful thing, far more real than the smooth, hollow piece Thorn was offering. "It's not real," Julian whispered, his voice cracking the illusion. "The perfection. It's just a grave with a better view." He dropped the pen. He dropped the crystal glass. He reached out and pulled the monsters toward him, embracing the cold, the fear, and the terrifying truth of their situation. With a roar of fury, the vision of the 1840s shattered. The study exploded into 1,000 shards of darkness, and Julian found himself back in the sweating limestone cellar. Thaddeus Thorn was gone, replaced by a towering pillar of shadow that stood over the foundation stone of the house. The insanity had failed because Julian had chosen the pain of reality over the comfort of a lie. But the house was not finished. The foundation stone began to crack, and a dark, oily substance began to pour out, filling the room. They weren't just in the cellar anymore. They were in the guts of the machine, and the machine was trying to drown them. Beatrice grabbed Julian, her eyes returning to their normal, terrified state. "You went away," she sobbed. "Your eyes went white, Julian. You almost walked into the wall." Julian didn't have time to explain. He saw the truth now. The house didn't want to kill them. It wanted to replace them. It wanted to use their bodies to walk the world while their souls stayed trapped in Thorn's perfect, static nightmare. He looked at the foundation stone and saw a small, brass plate hidden behind the grime. It was the heart, the central gear of the trap. The partial resolution was a hard-won clarity. Julian realized that the only way to break the cycle of insanity was to accept that they might not all make it out whole, but they would make it out true. He understood that the perfect families the locals spoke of, the ones who went mad, were the ones who had accepted Thorn's bargain. They had traded their reality for a dream, and their bodies had simply withered away while their minds stayed locked in the 1840s. The Millers were the first to fight back because they were the first to value their flaws more than the house's promises. The moral of this descent was the key to their survival. Acceptance of reality, however painful or terrifying, is the only bridge to freedom. A beautiful lie is still a prison. Julian had almost traded his family for a career that didn't exist and a peace that was nothing more than silence. By choosing the struggle, He had reclaimed his role as a father and a husband. He had stared into the heart of the insanity and found that it was built on the cowardice of a man who couldn't handle his own grief. But as the oily darkness reached their knees, a new sound began to echo from the foundation, a rhythmic, metallic grinding. The house was physically shifting one last time, pulling the exit even further away. The cellar was no longer a basement. It was becoming a well, and at the top of that well, the small walnut door they had seen on the first night was beginning to glow with a blinding, predatory light. The final choice was coming. They had to climb, or they would be buried alive in the architect's sorrow. The final heartbeat of Blackwood Hall did not sound like a drum. It sounded like the closing of a tomb. In the suffocating darkness of the Maryland cellar, the oily, ink-like substance had risen to Julian's waist, dragging at his legs with the weight of 1,000 forgotten sorrows. The amber light of Thaddeus Thorne's illusion had vanished, replaced by a cold, bioluminescent pulsing from the walls. The house was no longer trying to seduce them into madness. It was trying to drown them in it. Julian held Leo high above the rising tide, his muscles screaming with exhaustion, while Beatrice clawed at the limestone walls, searching for any handhold that wasn't slick with the house's tears. "The door!" Leo screamed, pointing upward. High above them, at the top of a vertical shaft that had replaced the cellar stairs, the small walnut door stood illuminated. It was the same door that had appeared mysteriously on their first night, the one that wasn't on any blueprint. It glowed with a fierce, blinding white light, a stark contrast to the murk of the basement. But the distance was impossible. The walls of the shaft were smooth and vibrating, shifting every few seconds to prevent any upward progress. The house was a living throat, and they were being swallowed. The conflict reached its terrifying peak as the shadows Julian had rejected in his vision began to manifest physically. Out of the dark water rose the gray versions of the Miller family, hollow-eyed, silent, and terrifyingly strong. The shadow Julian reached out with elongated fingers, trying to pull the real Julian under. The shadow Beatrice whispered terrible things into the real Beatrice's ear, reciting every failure and every doubt she had ever felt. The house wasn't just using physical force. It was using their own self-loathing as a tether. To escape, they had to be lighter than the grief that built these walls. "Don't look at them," Julian roared, his voice echoing through the hollow stone. "They aren't us. They are just the house's hunger." He looked at Beatrice, who was being dragged toward the dark corner by her own double. With a surge of adrenaline, Julian lunged forward, swinging the iron fire poker. The metal didn't strike bone. It passed through the shadow like smoke, but the intent behind the blow, the raw, protective love for his wife, caused the shadow to hiss and dissipate into a cloud of ash. He realized then that the house's architecture was held together by their belief in its power. Beatrice grabbed a heavy iron pipe from the wall and used it to hoist herself upward, her artist's eyes finding the rhythm in the house's shifting stones. "Leo, climb my back," she commanded. Together they formed a human chain, a literal ladder of bone and will. As the water rose to Julian's chest, he heaved Leo onto Beatrice's shoulders. The house groaned, a sound of tectonic frustration, and the walls began to compress. The air was escaping the room in great, wheezing gasps. Every time a shadow reached for them, they shouted a truth, a memory of a real birthday, a real scar, a real triumph. With every truth, the shadows recoiled. The final obstacle was the walnut door itself. As they reached the top of the shaft, the door didn't lead to the hallway they remembered. It opened into a void, a swirling vortex of gray mist where the voices of all the families who had gone insane before them wailed in a discordant choir. To step through was to risk falling into nothingness. Julian looked back at the cellar, which was now completely submerged in the black ink. There was no going back. He looked at Beatrice and Leo, their faces pale but their eyes bright with a defiance that no architect could design. "On three," Julian whispered, grabbing their hands. "1, 2, 3. They leapt together, not into the void, but through their fear of it. For a heartbeat, there was no sound, no weight, and no time. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, they hit solid ground. The air was suddenly filled with the smell of damp pine and wet earth. They were outside. They lay on the overgrown lawn of Blackwood Hall, the morning sun finally breaking through the Maryland fog. The house stood before them, silent and still, looking like nothing more than a beautiful, decaying Victorian estate. The resolution was swift and cinematic. As they watched, the grand front doors of Blackwood Hall settled into their frames with a final, heavy click. The windows, once like predatory eyes, were now just flat glass reflecting the blue sky. The house hadn't disappeared, but it had grown dormant. It had lost its fuel. Julian, Beatrice, and Leo crawled to their car, not looking back until the engine roared to life. As they drove down the gravel driveway, the iron gates swung shut behind them, the rust screaming one last time. They left behind the perfect home, choosing instead their cramped, messy, and wonderfully real life in the city. The moral of the Miller family's ordeal was a lesson for all who seek a shortcut to happiness. Love and honesty are the only forces that can break the strongest of curses. A home is not made of wood and stone, but of the truths we tell those we love. They had survived because they refused to let the house's lies replace their shared reality. They had looked into the abyss of insanity and found that it was only as deep as the secrets they kept from one another. As the car reached the main highway, Leo looked out the back window. For a split second, he saw a small boy in a woolen suit, Silas, standing on the widow's walk, waving a slow, sad goodbye. The boy wasn't a monster. He was just a memory that Thaddeus Thorne had refused to let go. Julian saw it too in the rearview mirror, but he didn't stop. He turned up the radio, the sound of a modern pop song filling the car, and pressed his foot on the accelerator. Blackwood Hall was now just a story they would tell, a legend of Maryland that served as a reminder that the most haunted places aren't always houses. Sometimes, they are the corners of our own hearts that we refuse to light.